Hello everyone, welcome back to D Squared Stories, an audio fiction podcast bringing you short serialized weekly stories. This week we are getting right back into the Immortal love, so without any further ado, let's get into a quick recap and then get started. Last time, Ron went to the funeral of his late father with his brother Darren. Their father pre-selected readings specifically about eternal life, which Ron took to be a dig at his own pursuit of attaining immortality through his pharmaceutical endeavors. At the funeral, Ron met Heather, a mild-mannered and somewhat quiet woman. In an attempt to convince her that he was better than his reputation would have her believe, he managed to swing planning a meetup at a bakery with her the next morning. At the funeral reception, Darren revealed to Ron that for some unknown reason to anyone but Heather, their father had left all of his possessions to her. Chapter 2. The Bakery. Ron stood staring at his brother. He waited for him to say he was joking, that this insane scenario of their father giving their childhood home and all of his other possessions away to a woman the two had just met yesterday was untrue. To Ron's surprise, his brother just stood there, in the balcony of the country club, awkwardly staring down towards the golf course as he took another swig of his beer. "You gotta be kidding me," Ron said. "This is messed up, even for him. Giving away everything to this random woman? I bet they were sleeping together. Sheesh, Pops, she's as young as Darren. Didn't think you were that kind of guy." "Ron, stop. We don't know that," he said. "Why is it always sex with you anyway?" "How else do you explain it? I get there was nothing coming my way, and I don't need it. But you went and reconciled with the man. What could push him to prioritize this lady over his own son?" Ron stopped for a moment. The wheels in his head turned as he started to recall the events of earlier today. "Wait a minute," Ron said. "Before any of this, I made plans with her to stop at a bakery tomorrow." "You did?" Darren asked. "Yeah, I was somewhat messing with her, expecting her to shrug me off. But she did eventually say yes. She must feel guilty about taking it. Maybe she doesn't even want it." "Slow down. Don't go pressuring her. If Dad did give it to her, he must have had a reason. I don't need Dad's house. It was falling apart the last time I visited him there. If she needs the money, let her sell it to flippers. I'll probably end up getting the contracts for rebuilding it anyway." Ron paused, stroking his mustache and drinking up the dregs of his gin and tonic, which was mostly just melted ice with a hint of lime at this point. "Fine, I won't. I will get to the bottom of this, though. I have to pick her brain to figure out what kind of relationship she had with Dad that led to this happening." "I'm okay with that. In fact, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't really curious myself," Darren said. Darren's wife, Jessica, came up the stairs and gave a pout to the two brothers. She then knocked on the window and gestured for them to come back down. "I guess we better be getting back down to the reception," Darren said. "Can't hide up here forever." "Don't be so sure about that," Ron said, but followed behind his brother as they went back down. The two rejoined their extended family in the reception hall. They caught up with cousins, aunts, and uncles they had not seen in a decade in some cases. Ron tactfully navigated through some not-so-subtle hints of financial hardship that could be remedied by a billionaire like himself. He always managed to slip free of them. Everyone in this room, his age or older, knew about the state of his father and how he and his brother were treated. Yet, Ron could never remember a moment that any of them came to offer support or intervene, so he felt no need to intervene in their alleged misfortunes. He treated all of them with apathy, with the exception of his darling, Anna and Jacob, whose company he preferred and who he thought had much more engaging topics of conversation. For example, which planet Ron was going to visit first, the tallest giraffe he had ever seen, and why Dalmatians had spots, but other dogs did not. When Ron felt his obligation to his brother and family was complete, he knowingly nodded to Darren from across the room and made his silent goodbye. Rohan was ready as always to pick him up and take him back to his suite. Ron got up bright and early the next morning and made it to Alapocas Bakery. He wore a baseball cap and shades. He scanned the restaurant for Heather. Despite it being 5 minutes after their agreed-upon arrival time, she was nowhere to be found. Ron shrugged, briefly thinking that maybe she was being facetious. Nonetheless, he ordered a cappuccino and banana nut muffin and sat at a table for two, checking his phone. He got lost in a handful of emails, causing him to miss the bell of the door as someone walked in. But he heard her voice clearly. "Hi. The rooibos tea and a pan au chocolat?" Heather's soft voice said. She smiled gently as the cashier rung her up and took her receipt. She then turned her attention to Ron and jumped a little, looking spooked. Ron looked behind him to see nothing. "What? You see a ghost or something?" he asked. She stepped closer and sat down. She had a book in hand. "No," she said. "I guess I just wasn't actually expecting you to meet me here. Why are you wearing that?" She pointed towards his hat and glasses. "I don't like to make a big show of being out in public with the press. Plus, there's a lot of people who would like to see me dead. A lot of women, actually." Heather looked at him unamused. On her face, he could see the brewing thought of asking to get her order to go. After managing to stifle it, she sat down across from him. The barista brought him his cappuccino and muffin. "So, you might find this hard to believe," he said, stopping for a sip. "But I had no idea about my old man's will when we arranged this yesterday." Heather's expression shifted to be uncomfortable at this. "Don't get nervous," he said. "We're not asking you to give it back or anything. It just caught both of us off guard, and I'm less tactful than my brother, so I'm curious how the two of you met." "He came up to me after Mass one of the days I was singing. He complimented my voice and asked if I wanted to get lunch sometime." Ron had to fight the urge to snicker, finding himself validated in his theory. The barista walked over the tea and the pastry to the table and set it in front of Heather. She warmed her hands up on the mug and looked into it. "I told him it wasn't a good time," she continued. "With final weeks and all, I had a lot of papers to grade." "Oh, you're a school teacher?" Ron asked. She nodded. "I teach at the elementary school associated with the church." "Good for you. Don't know how you do it. I think I'd tear my hair out with all those snot-nosed brats in the same room as me every day." Heather shot another unamused look at him. "It's a rewarding job," she said. "Plus, it's the closest I'll get to having kids of my own." Ron chuckled. He caught himself in how rude that might have seemed, and quickly moved to explain himself. "Sorry, you say that like it's too late. You're not that old. There's still time for you to have kids." Heather looked very stone-faced about this. She seemed to reflexively grab at her side with her right hand for some reason. Ron thought he was being reassuring, but sensed he had somehow only made the situation worse with that comment. "Anyway, are you going to try your pan au chocolate, or what? Don't just let it sit there." "Pan au chocolate." She spoke so quickly and frankly. "Pardon?" It's just pronounced pan au chocolate. Sorry." Ron blinked a few times. "What's there to be sorry about?" "I have a habit of correcting things. Grammar and pronunciation. People don't always like it." "Well, people should learn to deal with it. Everyone needs to be corrected here and there. This fear of correcting people is why so many people believe such idiotic things unchecked." There was a silence in the air. Heather did eventually try a bit of her pastry. She seemed to take her time chewing it, very deliberately. Ron was content to let the silence sit there and just watch her until she was done. She looked up at him in somewhat dramatic fashion. "You think the belief in the church is one of those idiotic things, don't you?" Ron seemed quite surprised. "Not one for small talk, are you, Miss Heather?" She continued to stare intently at him. He chuckled a bit. "Well, I like that in person," he said. "Yes, in all honesty, I find organized religion to be the greatest scam in all of human history. They draw people in with the promise of eternal life, otherworldly riches, and the claim to be the only right way to live life." He sneered as he said this. Heather patiently took a sip of her tea. He kept going. "You look like a woman who's followed these rules all her life. Spent probably hours reading the Bible, praying. Definitely not the type to sleep around. Doesn't some part of you ever wish that it wasn't real so you could enjoy all that?" "I don't think I would change much about my life if I didn't believe in God." She again spoke very swiftly in response to what he said. It could have almost been seen as blunt if it weren't so evidently sincere. Ron was momentarily stunned once more. "Now that can't possibly be true," he said. "You're telling me you've never once seen a guy and just wanted to have it, no strings attached? You're telling me you never once thought it might be fun to take a big gamble, put some real money down on something before going on a bender?" She smiled. "I like to put a few dollars down on the local horse race each year. Last year, the one I picked, Win Place Show, came in third, and I made all my money back and more." Ron raised an eyebrow and stared at her with a kind of bewilderment. Then he could not help but laugh a little. "You're funnier than I think you know, Miss Heather." "What makes you say that?" "Earlier, just even small remarks I made about being a womanizer or teasing you made you look like you were about to walk out on me. I come at the throat of your very dearest beliefs, and you just take it in stride." She tilted her head a little bit at this. "Of course, because earlier you were being rude and facetious. I might not agree with what you're saying, but at least for once you're being earnest," she said. Ron smirked again. This time, however, it was Heather's turn to keep going. "On the other hand, though, if you were convinced all this was real, would you be as aggressively pushing for your miracle immortality drug as much as you are?" As if premeditated, she blew on her tea and took a long sip after saying this question. Ron was unfazed, continuing to smirk on through this line of questioning. "That's my dark secret, Miss Heather," he said. "I don't know that I don't believe in any of this. The only thing I believe in, without a shadow of a doubt, is myself." "That seems like a lonely life." "At times, but it's not rife with disappointment. You might think it arrogant, Miss Heather, but I've always had the belief that my own greatness was inevitable." Ron paused, seeming to hope that this would get some rise out of her. She just continued to politely make eye contact with him. In this moment, he studied those bluish-gray eyes of hers. They were soft. From a distance, they might not draw that much attention, but up close, their beauty was unparalleled. He thought about the word she used earlier. Earnest. There was an earnestness to her expression, one of pure interest and lack of judgment. I don't think it's arrogant at all. It must be a good way to motivate yourself, to think that every obstacle in life is just a small delay to your inevitable success. She looked down, briefly pausing. Then she looked back up with a big grin. Have you ever seen the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel? Ron looked a bit confused. I can't say that I have. It's a great movie. Judi Dench and Maggie Smith are in it, and they're brilliant. But anyway, you remind me a bit of the hotel manager who always says, everything will be all right in the end. If it's not all right, it is not yet the end. Ron continued to stare, before briefly shaking his head. I suppose that's a nicer way of saying things will work out than saying my greatness is inevitable, he said. But also, I don't believe in an end. Be honest with me. If I could offer you a guaranteed eternal life here on Earth, you wouldn't take it? Their table went silent. Heather politely finished up her pastry and was getting to the bottom of her tea as she seemed to think about this. Ron also finished up his meal, studying her face intently as she thought her way through this. I don't know that I would, she said. There are a lot of people, my mom and dad, who have passed away and I miss dearly. I believe someday after this life I will get to see them again. Even if I can't be certain, I'd rather take that chance than be guaranteed to never have it. Ron was stunned again. In his own world, he often forgot that people could have loving relationships with their parents. He thought about what to say, but had no need as she added one more thing. It's not that I don't fear death or anything, but I really just fear dying alone, not surrounded by anyone who loves me. That being my end would be the hardest thing for me to handle. Dying in distress rather than passing away in peace. Ron struggled to think of what to say in response. He decided to try to diffuse the tension. I can understand that, he said. If I had to go, I would certainly prefer to be surrounded by hordes of adoring women. Heather's face quickly went from a solemn melancholy to frustration. She slid out her chair and stood up, quickly facing away from Ron. This was a terrible idea. Goodbye, Ron. He attempted to say something to get her to turn around as she walked away, but before he could, she suddenly grabbed at her side again. In a swift moment, she collapsed to the ground and let out a groan of sharp pain. Ron quickly jumped out of his chair and leapt to the ground to try to help her up, but she swatted his hand away. Hey, what's going on? He asked. Do you need an ambulance? No, she said. This just happens from time to time. She slowly brought herself up to her feet, just as the barista came out from behind the counter to try to help. A handful of people who had walked in stared at her. Ron, knowing this was just not an ordinary occurrence for ordinary people, stayed with her as she tried to limp her way out of the bakery. Each step was accompanied by a light gasp. At least let me walk you to your car, he said. I didn't drive here. I walked. It was about 7 blocks or so. Good grief, Ron said. Let me call my ride then. I'm not letting you walk half a mile in this state. Ron quickly pulled out his phone and texted Rohan to come and pick them up. Heather looked to want to protest this, but the sharp pain seemed to overwhelm her, and she did not put up a fight. The two stepped outside the bakery. It had started drizzling since they came in on this dreary morning. Heather finally stood up straight and exhaled. It seemed whatever had come over her had passed for the time being, which relieved Ron, but not fully. Rohan pulled the car up to the other side of the street, and Ron quickly crossed after checking no cars were coming either way. He turned around to see that Heather had not followed him. He sighed. He figured, now that she was feeling temporarily better, she was going to try to tough it out through this rain. However, then he looked again and noticed something. She was standing at the crosswalk, and as soon as the light turned to walk, she crossed it. Ron stared in confusion as this was a back street with hardly any traffic, but nonetheless, she seemed to have been patiently waiting for her turn to cross. She walked up to him. What? What's wrong? She asked. He shook his head. It's nothing. He opened the back door for her to let her in. She slid all the way to the other side, and he got in next to her. Rohan smiled, looking at both of them in the rearview mirror. Ah, Miss Heather, he said. It is a pleasure to meet you. Where will you be getting dropped off? Heather smiled at his genuine politeness. 222 West Fountain Street. Ron's eyebrows immediately raised. Hey, isn't that... Heather nodded. She had just given the address of Darren and Ron's childhood home, the house she inherited from the late Jeremiah Young. I was starting to organize the place, she said. There's a lot of stuff, photos and whatnot. I figured at least Darren would probably like to have them. Ron paused thinking of what to say, but Rohan cut in. He was always the more sentimental one of the two, he said. Oh, have the two of you met? she asked. Plenty of times. Mr. Young has a big holiday celebration at the end of each year. On occasion, the younger Mr. Young and his wife will attend. They are a lovely couple, aren't they? Heather smiled. They really are. Is there a Mrs. Rohan in your life? There is indeed, Miss Heather. Her name is Amrita. She lives out west. We are expecting our first child somewhat soon. Can you believe she will not let me name him Ronald? Ron smirked and shook his head, having heard this joke several times in the 3 months since Rohan announced this to him. Heather chuckled at it as well. That must be so hard being so far apart from her during this time. Oh, it's nothing too bad. I get several weeks off a year to fly back and visit her. Mr. Young even pays for the flights each way. She turned to stare at him. That's awfully generous. He is a very generous employer. Since he took me on as his main driver, I make triple what I could make doing this anywhere else. My family will get to live a comfortable life thanks to Mr. Ron. Ron scoffed. It's all thanks to you. What I do is just what's rational. If I'm going to put my life in the hands of someone every day, I better make it worth their while to make sure I end each day alive. Heather smiled as he tried to dismiss this. And I have not let you down yet, have I, sir? Rohan asked. No, you have not, he said. I have the best lawyers in the world, but if I ever end up in jail with one phone call, let me tell you, it's going to be you, Rohan. He smiled and pulled up at the address of the former Young household. Here you are, Miss Heather, Rohan said. Thank you, Rohan, she said. She got out of the car. Before closing the door, she briefly paused and looked at Ron. Ron could not place what was going through her head as she stared at him. Finally, she spoke. If you have the time, would you mind coming in to take some things out for you and Darren? Ron looked at the house. It had been over 20 years since he had stood in his childhood home. There was a look of apprehension on his face. He thought about his father and the bad memories he had experienced in that household. Then something flickered back into his mind. He had never gotten what he was looking for from today. He had cut her off in the middle of explaining how she and his father had met, derailed their conversation. Reframing his reason for being there gave him the motivation to keep going. Yeah, I have some time, he said. Rohan, go grab yourself something to eat. I'll be here a while. Yes, sir. Ron got out of the car and Rohan drove off. He slowly walked into the house with Heather. Before even getting through the front door, he saw the roof was in disrepair. As they stepped in, he saw chipping paint and old light fixtures. The couch he had sat on in childhood was still in the living room, in less than stellar condition. The railing going up the stairs was nearly falling off the wall. Good grief, Dad, he said. This place is more of a punishment than a gift. Yeah, Heather said. I was hoping to get the stuff out of here as soon as I could, so I could get it on the market for someone with money to fix it up. Ron looked offended by this. Hey, don't go selling our childhood home to some house flippers. Heather looked at him, a bit taken aback by this sudden display of sentimentality. All I mean is, Ron said, they won't care for it. Let me pay Darren's guys to fix it up for you. I'll make sure that you get a livable place and keep the charm. It'll be good for business, and he'll like having a chance to redo the place, I think. You'll be living in the best house ever afterwards. She sighed. I appreciate it, but I could never ask you to do that. I don't know how long I'd be living here anyway. You skipping town or something? He asked. Heather froze up and bit her lip. She did not answer and just walked across the room and over to a cardboard box. She looked at what was inside it. She then grabbed a label maker from the table in the kitchen and started to print out a label for it. She labeled the box, Young Family Photos. Then she pulled a framed picture from the box. 5 or so year old Ron holding his baby brother. In the photo, he smiled ear to ear. You look so happy in this. Such a proud big brother, she said. Ron chuckled, clocking the fact that she did not answer his question, but not pressing her on it. I was happy back then. Our mom was still alive, and my dad hadn't yet decided he loved bottles of liquor more than his only 2 sons. She seemed to pout at this. Then she gestured over to a desk in another room. It was cluttered with papers. That's probably what I need the most help with, she said. I'm not sure if you know this, but your dad became something of a prolific letter writer towards the end of his life. I'm aware. I probably threw dozens of his pleas for reconnection out in the past year or so. Heather looked disappointed at this, but managed to power through. Anyway, he had a lot of unfinished letters before he passed. A lot of them are made out to people who I think are in your family, but he never got around to specifically addressing them, so I'm not sure where they would go. Would you mind taking a look and seeing if you have any you can mail? Sure thing, he said. Internally, he was frustrated to have to read even the slightest bit of his dad's writing, but he complied. He looked through and found letter after letter, only partially finished, to some of his father's siblings and cousins. It seemed for some time now, Jeremiah was aware of his impending demise. He seemed to put a lot of thought and care into his final words to them. so much so that he never got around to finishing them before he died. In Ron's mind, he found a way to twist this into a bad thing, that even at the very end of his life, his father could not do anything right. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a letter with a different style of handwriting, one much nicer and neater than his father by miles. He quickly grabbed it and read it. Dear Jeremiah, I agree with you. Life really is a small world. I would have never guessed so shortly after meeting you at church that we would have been sharing an emergency room at the hospital together, and corresponding via letter shortly after that. I think it's very sweet that you handwrite all these letters to your close friends and family, and I'm glad you considered me to be one of them now. I felt like it was not right that no one ever wrote you back. A call on the phone is nice, but I do think a handwritten letter is even better. I hope you don't mind how awful my penmanship is. I am so glad that both of us made it out of there. Like you said, I hope we have much longer than the doctors said we did. Not that any of these treatments seem to do anything for me, despite how expensive they are. Not sure how much longer I'll be able to afford them. I'm really glad to hear that you made amends with your son Darren. I know it's discouraging, but I wouldn't give up on your son Ronald. I see him in the news frequently. Everyone sees him as this business mega-genius. However, I agree with you. I can't help but feel deep down inside he's hurting, and I think that might be the real reason he wants to push you away. I would not mind continuing our chats in person as well. I sing at the next 9:30 Mass. We could walk afterwards to a great bakery called Alapocas. Let me know if you would want to do that. Sincerely, Heather Bell. Ron read the letter carefully and over again. It seemed far less of an illicit relationship like he had originally thought, and rather one of complete chance. He thought of how strange his father was to strike up a friendship with a woman 30 years younger than him, and end up giving her his house. It made sense to him now, though. All of this was in the aim of giving her a chance to pay for these expensive medical treatments. He passed the paper to the side and continued to rifle through the half-finished letters. One of them stuck out to him. Dear Heather, I hope I manage to finish this before my time is up. I would really hate for our last interaction to be the last you remember of me. I know what I am asking of you is a lot, and I know you feel like you are the last person capable of being able to do this. However, I just know it has to be you. I have felt this way for some time now. I have known that in my own lifetime, I will never be able to reconnect with my son, to heal the hole I left in his heart. It is just like you said when we first met. Inside, you know he is hurting, that he has lost his way. I have been a terrible father in my life, but for all my faults, I do know my son's. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt this is my last chance. Despite your protests, I will be leaving my home and possessions to you. Darren will be confused, but understand in time. Ron will be driven to curiosity by it. I have no doubts. Please, I know what I have asked of you is incredibly difficult, but it is my final wish. I hope with all of my heart you will make it come true. Sincerely, Jeremiah Young. Thank you so much for listening to this chapter of The Immortal Love. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast, give it a like on YouTube, or share with someone else who you think might also enjoy. You can stay up to date with The Immortal Love by following us on social media. That'll be D Squared Stories on just about any of the major platforms. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to have you listen again next week.